Jesus, praise his name.
Well, good morning. I hope it's as beautiful a day where you are as it is here. It's absolutely gorgeous. Temperature is fantastic. We got a little shower yesterday afternoon. Everything's clean. The air's clean and clear. Beautiful, beautiful day. Good day to be together with God's people, even if it is virtually being together, right? I noticed something about being here. There's about half a dozen of us scattered out across a big auditorium here. And when we sing, if you miss a note, it surely does stand out. I noticed that. When you've got 500 or 600 people here, if you miss a note, nobody can hear you, but they can hear you if you miss a note right now. Some of you have text me or call me and let me know about your singing at home, and said probably nobody's going to call and try to get you to record or anything, but it's really good to sing together, and I really love it and appreciate it. It's a special day for our young man in our congregation too, by the way. One of our fine young men, Daniel Bryant, is having a 10th birthday today. So, happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you, happy birthday, dear Daniel, happy birthday to you. Now, Daniel, you just had about 1,000 people sing happy birthday to you. If you didn't hear them, then be aware of that. Happy birthday. Hope it's a good one. 400 years before Christ was born, there was a trial in Athens, Greece. The Greek philosopher Socrates, at the end of this trial, was sentenced to death by drinking poisoned hemlock. He was pronounced guilty of 2 crimes, one crime being corrupting the youth of Athens. And it was because he caused them to question the pantheon, the gods of Athens and the Greeks. And interestingly, even though most of us recognize the name of Socrates, Socrates left no writings. But he did have a student by the name of Plato who was present at the trial, and he wrote a detailed account of the defense that Socrates made. And undoubtedly, the statement that caught the fancy of historians and consequently has survived until this day, in his defense, somewhere along that trial, Socrates made evidently the statement, "An unexamined life is not worth living." I'm sure you've heard that quoted. For the last few lessons, we have been examining the fundamental Christian principle, doctrine of faith. The Bible is all about faith, from beginning to end. A practical definition of faith is trusting God completely. The Bible, particularly the New Testament, is filled with statements, really terse statements regarding faith, the importance of faith. Hebrews 11:6 says, without faith it's impossible to please God. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7 says, we walk by faith and not by sight. Faith is the victory that overcomes the world, John said in 1 John 5:4. And Romans chapter 1, verse 17 quotes an Old Testament statement that is quoted throughout the Bible, by faith the righteous will live. And if you stop and think about these statements, without faith it's impossible to please God. We walk by faith and not by sight. Faith is a victory that overcomes the world. By faith the righteous will live. And that's just an inkling of how important faith is. And we saw in our last lesson that some of these verses and others speak of what faith is and others speak of what faith does. And I would propose to you that an unexamined faith, and I thought a lot before I put the rest of it, and I would challenge you to finish that sentence. An unexamined faith and then you fill it out. You can be thinking about that while we talk about this lesson, while we go through this lesson. And if you really come up with something that's really good, then text me about it, all right? An unexamined faith. And what I came up with was an unexamined faith contains absolutely no power. Luke records a brief but fascinating exchange between Jesus and Peter as they were near the end of what we call the Last Supper. Jesus knows that his disciples are about to face the most troubling event of their lives. They are about to witness his arrest, his trial, and his crucifixion. Their faith is going to be put to the test. And he looks at Peter and he says, "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you all as wheat." And the "you all" is plural. All the disciples there assembled. And then he says, "But I have prayed for you," singular, you Peter, you Simon, "that your faith may not fail." That's in Luke chapter 22. And Peter had to be somewhat not only surprised, but hurt that Jesus would single him out, because we know Peter well enough to know that Peter thought he had the greatest faith of all, right? And Jesus said, "Satan has asked to sift all of you like wheat, but Simon, I'm praying for you, that your faith won't fail." And Peter immediately begins to assure the Lord, "I will go to prison with you. I will even die with you." But Jesus knows that he's about to stumble and that his faith is going to temporarily fail him. You know, our faith has to have some meat on the bones to be of any real value in times of difficulty. Otherwise, it'll fail us when it's put to the test. However, we can't wait until the test comes, because we don't know when the test is going to come. We can't wait and then cram for the test and try to build our faith up. The faith that you have when difficulty comes into your life depends on what you're doing right now and what you have done in the past in order to build your faith up. In 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, we have a statement that many of us are familiar with. It says, "Always be prepared to give an answer." And that word is a verbal defense. Always be prepared to give a verbal defense to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that you have. And as I think about that statement, I realize that that's as much for my benefit as it is the person who might ask me about my faith. Because how deep and strong my faith is has everything to do with the security that I feel in life. It has everything to do with the direction that my life takes. It has everything to do with what I depend on. It has everything to do with what happens when the stock market drops 30%. How does that make me feel? How upset am I because of that? What do I depend on for my future? All those things and many, many more. And so it's for our benefit that we're ready to give an answer. Be prepared to give an answer for anybody who asks you about the hope that you have. And you know, I dare say that when we hear, most of us hear that verse, we immediately think, well, that means I've got to have enough verses memorized so that I can answer any question that somebody might ask me about my faith. And that scares us off, doesn't it? And we think, boy, I don't have enough verses memorized. I don't know what I would say if somebody asked me, what am I going to do if somebody asked me a question that I don't know the answer to? Well, calm down, first of all. And I want you to consider this, and I think it's really important. Do you realize, and this may come as a shock to you, do you realize that the folks to whom this was written, that Peter wrote this, did not have a New Testament? And so he wasn't telling them to have all the New Testament memorized so that they could go to this verse and this verse and this verse and prove this. I think it's more in line with what he means if someone were to come to you today and say, why are you a Christian? Why should I be a Christian? What would you say? I'm not saying that there's just one right answer here. And I'm not saying that I might not say something different at different times in my life and under different circumstances, or depending on who asked me the question and what I knew about that person. But right now, and I thought about this in preparing this lesson, right now, I would simply say something like, if somebody came to me and said, why are you a Christian? Why should I be a Christian? What does it do for you? Then I think I would say something like, being a Christian provides me with security right now in my life and a consistent hope for the future. That's practically what Christianity does for me, and that's why I'm a Christian. Or depending on the person, I might say, because I'm a Christian, I'm not afraid to die. And that person might or they might not want to pursue that at that moment. They might want to think about that, and they might come back to you at some point and say, you know, I asked you one time why I should be a Christian and why you were a Christian, and you said so and so and so and so, and then they might have another question. But you planted the seed, and you planted a good seed. And I would say right now is a pretty good time to plant seed, wouldn't you, about the gospel? I mean, there's a lot of concern out there right now. There's a lot of fear that people have all over the world, not just right here, not just in our community, but all over the world. Since we're putting some meat on the bones of our faith, I'm going to serve you up a T-bone steak this morning, all right? So get ready for it. We're going to cover lots of information, and I think really valuable information. I want us to consider a logical, reasonable answer to something that we need to understand, first of all, so that we will be more prepared to give an answer for the hope that we have in Christ Jesus. And specifically, I want you to clearly understand so that you can be able to explain, why did Jesus have to die? Why did Jesus have to die? Why the cross? And the short, precise answer to that is because of God's righteousness and because of God's love. That's the answer. Now, that requires lots of explanation, but that's the answer to why Jesus went to the cross. Let's consider, first of all, Jesus went to the cross because God is righteous. And that has lots of implications. And we certainly don't have the time, and I don't have the ability to tell you what all those implications are. But the one that connects to our question about why did Jesus have to die, and we say because God is righteous, simply says God's righteousness requires that every single sin that is ever committed be punished. There's not going to be one sin that's ever committed from the beginning of time till whenever the Lord comes back with his big ring of keys and says, okay, guys, it's closing time. There's not going to be one single sin that's committed that's going to fall through the cracks. Every single sin is going to be punished. Why? Because God is righteous. Well, what does that mean to me? Acts chapter 17, verse 31 says, God has set a day in which he'll judge the world. Hebrews 9:27 says, man is destined to die once, and after that to face judgment. Romans 3:19 says, every mouth at that point of judgment, every mouth will be silenced, and the whole world become guilty before God. Romans chapter 3 says, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. There is none righteous, not even one. So number one, I'm a sinner, and so are you. And that brings up the question, well, what punishment is required because I'm a sinner? What's the penalty for sin? Well, Romans chapter 6, verse 23 gives us the answer, doesn't it? The wages of sin is death. And he's not just talking about physical death. Physical death is a separation of our body from our soul or our spirit. But this death that he's talking about here, spiritual death, is our separation from God for all eternity. That's the second death, spiritual death. God, do you realize, could have left everything right there. We're all sinners. He's righteous. Judgment comes. We're all condemned. We're separated from him. God could have left it right there, and he could have been righteous. He would have been righteous. But there's another essential characteristic to God's nature. And you know what that is, right? We love this one. God is love. It says that at least twice in the New Testament. God is love. John 3:16. We're all familiar with that passage, right? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. God gave his Son because he loves us. Now, that's the short answer. But your faith will be much stronger, and you will be much less likely to have doubts. You will be more secure. You will be more capable of sharing that faith, and frankly, you will be far more willing to share that faith if you understand even more than that. Now, that's the short answer. But let's go a little bit deeper. Why did God have to give his Son? And when I use the word have to, I want you to understand that I don't mean he didn't have a choice. God could have chosen not to do that, and he would have remained righteous. But when I say he had to, if God wanted to accomplish his ultimate purpose of redeeming man, he had to do it this way. Why did God have to give his Son? What did that accomplish? Why did Jesus die on a cross? And the short answer again is because he took the punishment for my sins and yours. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21, and I use this verse so often that I may have to have request that this is put on my tombstone one of these days. I don't know. I really, really like this verse. It so succinctly summarizes it. It says, God made him who had no sin to become sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Now that's a verse that requires lots and lots of contemplation. God made him who had no sin, that would be Jesus, his Son, to become sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. And even though I can't comprehend why, God loved you and he loved me so very much that he devised a way to adequately punish my sins and offer me his righteousness in one single act, the cross. And that brings up a question that takes us one step deeper even. Why Jesus? Why death on a cross? And we're not going to be able to expound on every single phase of this, but couldn't God have saved us some other way? I mean, after all, I've heard all my life that God is so powerful he can do anything, right? Couldn't God have chosen some other way to save mankind? Well, I would suggest to you, if he could have, he would have. Paul will write to the Galatian Christians, if a law could have been given that could have given life, verily righteousness would have come by law. So it wasn't a matter of he gave the old law and it wasn't just right, so he adjusted it and he gave us a new law. It's not by law that he makes us righteous. In fact, I want you to turn to Hebrews chapter 2. And while you're turning there, let me give you a little quick background. This letter is unique, as they all are, but this one is unusual in the sense that it does not have an introduction like most of the New Testament letters do that tell you who the recipients of the letter, who the writer of the letter is. We don't have that in Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1 just jumps right in the middle of some really deep material here. From the content of the letter, however, it becomes obvious it is written to an audience that is an audience similar to the audience that the Galatian letter was written to. It was written to Jewish Christians who needed reassurance that they had not made a mistake in becoming a Christian. They had, these Jews that had become Christians had abandoned their Jewish heritage, their family, their religion, their society, everything about their life. They had abandoned it when they became a Christian, and they were obviously at some point along the way, as the consequences of that decision became heavier and heavier, and more pressure was put on them, now they're obviously considering returning to what they had left. This letter was written to show the superiority of Christianity over the old covenant. Or if we want to look at it from a doctrinal standpoint, it was written to show the superiority of a grace-faith system over a law-works system. Let me say that again. If we want to look at this deeper than just the surface and what these individual Christians were enduring and going through, and get down to what the real crux of the matter is, whenever we talk about the superiority of this new covenant over the old covenant, he's talking about the superiority of a grace-faith system over a law-works system. The books of the epistles of Romans and Galatians and Hebrews have that in common. They're all doing that. And in the first 3 chapters of Hebrews, his writer is demonstrating the superiority of Jesus Christ over both angels and Moses. And one of the questions which immediately arises is, if Jesus is deity, if he's God's Son, and if he is in fact greater than angels, then why become a human? And the quick answer is in chapter 2, verse 9. It says, Jesus was made a little lower than the angels so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. Now, that's the answer. We might have to have some explanation about what that answer means. That's what he did, and now the writer is going to tell us why it was necessary that he do it. And he's going to give us 3 reasons. Why the cross? Why did God have to become man and hang on a cross? Number 1 is in chapter 2, verse 11. I wish we had time to go through the whole context, but we'll just pick out the specific verses, and then you can come back and pick up the context between them, and I think you'll see that it's very consistent. Chapter 2, verse 11 says, both the one who makes men holy and those who are made holy are, the text says, literally, are one. Are, the New International Version says, are of the same family. And so for this reason, the fact that the one who makes men holy and those who are made holy have to be the same, have to be one of the same family, the sacrifice, whatever sacrifice was to be made to make men holy, had to be a human being. If there's any question in your mind about whether or not that's what he's saying, then drop down to the first part of verse 14. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity. Still talking about the same thing, same family, humanity. And a little later in this letter, in chapter 10, verse 4, it says it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. And so the first requirement that had to be met that demonstrates why Jesus had to die on the cross is the sacrifice, the one who makes men holy, and those who are made holy have to be human. He had to be a human being. Second reason, chapter 2, verse 14. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might destroy him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil. Not only did he have to be a man, But he had to be somebody who was more powerful, a man who was more powerful than Satan was. Well, that just left me out. I got the first one. I could hang in with the first one. I'm a human, but I'm not more powerful than Satan. And anybody who thinks he is a fool. And there are lots of people that think you can play with the devil and get away with it. You can't. He's smarter and he's more powerful than you are. I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is. I wish he weren't, but he is. And the only defense that we have against Satan is found in Jesus Christ. This says that the man who would be the sacrifice had to be more powerful than Satan. And the specific area of power that was taken, that he took away from Satan, is called in this verse the strength of death. The strength of death. Now you stop and think about what is he talking about? What does that mean? The strength of death was taken away from him. Well, the next verse tells us a little more about what he's talking about. Verse 15 says, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. Does death hold fear to human beings? Well, I'll tell you this. If you want to run a little experiment, next time you're in a group of people and y'all are having a party and you're having lots of fun, start talking about dying. See what happens. See how many people start scattering. People don't want to talk about dying. Don't want to think about dying. Why? Because we're afraid of it. But you remember when we started out and I said, if somebody came up to me and said, why are you a Christian? Why should I be a Christian? One of the responses that I would give that person potentially is, because I'm not afraid to die. Now, can you say that? You know, not too long ago, and the folks here at Woodland Oaks will probably remember, at least some will remember, if they remember anything I said, that I had a heart attack here 2 or 3 years back. And I can remember when that was happening, and they did the EKG, and the doctor told me, said, Mr. Stegall, you hang on, you're having an acute heart attack, and we've got to start moving really fast, and we don't have time to explain to you what's about to happen. And they're taking me up to surgery, and I can remember what I was thinking. And what I was thinking was, I may be about to see what I've lived for my whole life. And I have to tell you, I was really happy after it was all over. First, that I was alive, that was good. But I was happy that I was not terrified when that happened. That's what faith does for you. That's what faith, because I believe when I die, I'm going to begin experiencing the best, by far, the best thing that I've ever known in my existence. Now, if that's true, and if I really believe that, then why should I be afraid to die? How many times did Jesus say, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of what men can do to you. Don't be afraid. Boy, you can begin to live for the first time in your life if you can get over this fear of death. And Jesus Christ, and the Hebrew writer would say, he went into the strong man's house, he tied him up, and he came out victorious. Up from the grave, he arose, right? And so, we don't have to be afraid of dying any longer. Why? Because of the resurrection. That's why. Because death is not the end. Because he's going to come back one day and he's going to redeem me, he's going to bring us home. And then the third reason that Jesus went to the cross, not only it had to be a human, it had to be stronger than Satan and be able to take his power away from him. Then the third reason is in verse 17 and 18. For this reason, he had to be made like his brothers in every way. Just in case you're not sure, you think I might be pulling this out of thin air here. He's telling you why Jesus had to be made like his brothers. In order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people, because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he's able to help those who are being tempted. The purpose of a high priest was to intercede to God on behalf of the people, to offer sacrifices for their sin. Listen to chapter 4, verse 14 through 16. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who's gone into heaven, that's talking about me and you, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith that we profess. For we do not have a high priest who's unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who's been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet without sin. Let us then, here's the consequence of us having that high priest, let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. And so the third reason that Jesus had to go to the cross, he had to be a human, had to be more powerful than Satan. Number three, he had to be able to continue to help me after he died, after he was crucified. And so Jesus has up from the grave, arisen. He has become my high priest. He is at the right hand of the Father making intercession on my behalf. And so I can come before the throne of God with boldness and with confidence and lay out whatever I want to lay out at God's feet. And Jesus, as my high priest, he takes care of me, if you'll allow this, negatively and positively. You see, I say that because we find mercy. And mercy deals with the negative things. Mercy deals with how I should be punished. But because of him, God acts toward me with mercy. He doesn't give me the punishment that I deserve because my sins have already been punished. And then positively, not only does he not punish me and give me the punishment that I'm due because of Jesus, then he offers me his righteousness as a gift. That's grace. And so we find mercy and grace at the throne of God. And so we can come with confidence because Jesus is our high priest. Now that's what he did. He died on the cross. That's why it had to be done. And now real quickly, here's what it accomplished. Romans chapter 5, verse 18. As a result of one act of righteousness, justification brings life for all men. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 10. We have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. The cross, it demonstrates God's justice. It demonstrates God's inconceivable love. It satisfies the demands of God's righteousness that every sin be punished. And so if today I'm a Christian, if I am in Jesus Christ, then my sins have already been punished. By his stripes, I have been healed. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 24. That's good news, isn't it? It came at incredible cost. There is no other way that man could have been saved. The way of the cross leads home. There's no other way but this. And you know, it's been there all along. We just couldn't put the pieces of the puzzle together until it actually happened. John the Baptist, he had it right at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, didn't he? Remember when John was baptizing on the other side of the Jordan and Jesus came and John stopped what he was doing and he called attention to Jesus? You remember what he called him? He said, "Behold, God's Lamb that takes away the sins of the world." There it is. I love the words of a song that we sing. I haven't known the song for a long time. Sonny taught it to me, and some of you may have known it a lot longer, but one of the lines in it says, "Who would have thought that a lamb could rescue the souls of men?" Who would have thought that a lamb could rescue the souls of men? Our faith is based on personal knowledge and understanding. The deeper our understanding is, the more secure our faith is. And an unexamined faith contains no power. The world is filled with darkness and temptation and pain and suffering and heartache and loneliness, and it can be terribly discouraging and lonely. But as Christians, we have something that no one else has. We have a secure faith. And consequently, because Jesus went to the cross, the basis and foundation of our faith, we have a sure, steadfast hope. Our future is secure. 1 John chapter 5, verse 4 and 5. Faith is the victory that overcomes the world. I don't know how you're getting through these days that we're going through right now, this coronavirus shutdown thing and all the fear that's associated. I don't know what that's doing to you personally. I don't know how you're managing to get through it. But I hope it's because of your faith. I hope it's because you know God and that you know that nothing is out of God's control. I don't always know what God's plan is, but I know God. And I know Him well enough to know that everything is in control. And I don't have to be afraid. And even if I were to die, I just got my ticket punched to go home. And Jesus promised His disciples, I'm coming back, and I'll receive you unto myself so that where I am, you may be also. Boy, that's the result of our faith, isn't it? If we will take the time to examine our faith, ask the questions. We may not always have all of the answers, and our knowledge only goes so deep, but it goes far deep enough so that our faith can be grounded in solid, secure truth and reality. I want you to have that faith. I want you to build your faith. And I want to encourage you to get into God's Word. I hope you made some notes about what we're talking about.